Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Complicated Creation. This will be Part 15, Chapter 11, entitled, History is Not as Ancient as One Might Think. Shota takes Deku to Recovery Girl, who's currently checking in on Eri. It says far too much about matters that Deku's more upset about the holes in his new shirt than the burns under it and his split lip, or how he's so calm about Bakugo and their apparent history. The lost memory that had saved young Yuna's life and gotten them out of the spirit realm in one piece. It doesn't add up either. Bakugo's attitude certainly doesn't indicate friendship, but Deku had cried when he'd given up the memory. Was it just the action of doing so? Had they been closer once? Was Bakugo reacting more because of a false belief that Deku was working with the League? Bakugo had been showing some improvement recently regarding his temper, but attacking someone outright was grounds for expulsion. Suspension at minimum, and yet Aizawa had backed down from both almost instantly, only in part because of Deku. Said boy is also still trying to reassure him. "I'm all right," he says again as they head to his room, Shota trailing at his heels. "I had a lot of bullies. He must have just been the biggest one if I thought he was worth trading." Shota can't even begin to argue that. He doesn't have enough information. Instead, he leans on the doorframe as Deku enters his room and does something Shota's seen him do every time he's walked inside. He checks the paper prayers pasted everywhere. He checks every one. Then he sits down on the foot of his bed and looks up at Shota. "Are you going to expel him?" "He attacked you," Shota points out, reasonably, because he could. "I should have responded faster. I'm sorry." He'd been dozing in the lounge, head in Hisaashi's lap since the lounge was otherwise empty at the end of the day. He'd taken too long to realize that Bakugo's ranting wasn't his usual tone, that he'd been targeting Deku. "I mean, I'm pretty sure he thought I was a villain, though." Deku stops and seems to think better of whatever he was going to say. "I don't think you should expel him, unless you think he's completely terrible, and even then, expelling him won't teach him anything. Kicking people out doesn't help them." Deku puts on a serious face, something Shota's beginning to recognize as a thing his kid does whenever he thinks something is a big deal. He'd worn it a lot during their adventures through Magic Hell, and donned it every time he talked about the state of Eri's quirk. "A lot of people who have problems end up with no one to help them when they're too old, and they can't do anything to fix it," he says with enough feeling that Shota thinks Deku doesn't just know this offhand, he's seen it. Considering what he said about where else he's lived since escaping whatever facility they had him in, Shota doesn't need to guess to know it's lived experience. "He was scared and angry. I don't think he was trying to kill me or even hurt me that badly if you think about it. He's a hero student, and he obviously controls his explosions. He could have blinded me, for one thing, or grabbed my neck. If he'd covered my face or made me inhale, he could have burned my esophagus, which could kill me pretty quickly, actually." Shota listens in growing horror as Deku details the ways that Bakugo didn't kill him, and all the ways his quirk might be used to do so, based on the assumption of power of Bakugo's smallest explosions. Shota thinks about the time Bakugo had blown the head off of a training dummy by accident. Kaminari had misjudged his discharge nearby, and Bakugo had recoiled while aiming. And he has to agree with Deku's flawed assessment that Bakugo hadn't been intending to kill him or do extreme harm, but he'd still attacked a visitor in the school halls. Deku's not done, however. "He's still a kid," he points out, all reason. "If he's going to get better, the best chance is now, right? So he can't have teachers give up on him, because that just tells him it's okay to give up on himself and on other people. A lot of people in the streets say that someone gave up on them, and they gave up on themselves. And you said that he was kidnapped by the League of Villains." "They held him for 3 days. Deku winces. "So if he thinks I was working with them, he'd probably want to take me out. I mean, he should have gone to you and talked to you about it, obviously, but I'm okay, and Recovery Girl fixed me up." Shota hates to admit that Deku's got a point, but the kid has a point. "Anyone tell you that you're too forgiving, problem child?" Fuck, but he hopes Nezu's serious about helping tutor Deku. He's a kid with so much potential that's gone to waste. He is still being punished for this. "Of course he is," Deku nods. "I mean, obviously he shouldn't have done it, but it should be something that makes him think about what to do better next time, not something that just makes him more bitter or afraid." And that's the thing. Bakugo had been afraid, and Deku had picked up on that, possibly before Shota himself had. He'd been furious about Bakugo attacking someone outright, breaking multiple rules that Shota had explicitly reminded him of time and time again. But after the initial anger and defense of Deku had faded, there had been no mistaking that Bakugo was off. This wasn't just a loose temper flaring. This was something deeper. "So, are you going to be a teacher next?" Shota deadpans, and it's funny in his head. Hilarious, really, because he thinks Deku might be the only kid he's met who had the guts to outright give him teaching advice. Of course, funny in his own head backfires when Deku flinches and ducks down and stutters, flailing empty hands. No, I mean, you can do what you want. You're the teacher, his teacher. I mean, I think you're his teacher, right? I didn't even check, but he is a hero student, and I didn't mean to tell you how to do your job, and... Enough, Deku, it's fine. I was joking. Shota needs to work on his delivery, and probably work to acclimate Deku to his humor, though they also need to work on the whole Deku thing. You know, I'd wondered about the name Deku. The kid stops flailing at least and sighs. I know. Useless isn't exactly the nicest name, but I've been Deku for years. We could change it, Shota points out, not bothering to beat around the point. Pick a name you want and we can use that instead. I've thought about it, Deku says, in the sort of tones that suggest the thoughts haven't ever gotten far. I guess I can think about it some more. You don't have to. Shota doesn't want him thinking this is mandatory. But you've got a new school, new friends, new people to look after you. He knows better than to say family too early. He'd learned that the hard way with Shinso. So if you want a new name, this would be a good time to start. Okay. Deku smiles softly, not one of his usual brilliant grins or the wry, sardonic grimaces, but something quiet and thoughtful. I'll think about it. Good. I'm going to go deal with Bakugo. We can do your session with Eri when we're done. Deku nods in affirmation, and Shota leaves him as he reaches for his new laptop. And really, how could they not set him up with a proper computer? And Shota heads to find Bakugo and see what his version of the events of today are. Izuku shakes off the encounter and loads up Google to do something he's meant to do for a while now, as all of this has unintentionally reminded him. It's been a niggling thought, really, just in the back of his head. And he types Kitsune into the search engine. A few minutes later, and he's found a link for a name. Tamamo no Me. He can't tell if he's surprised or not. Everyone has a name, after all, and maybe it's a coincidence, but he doubts it. After the third retelling, he realizes he's probably not going to find out anything more specific online, and he doesn't have the time or inclination to try to find older translations, not when he can ask someone who was there. He sets the computer aside and gets to his feet, opening the door to his room and tugging on her name once more, though less desperate this time. Can we talk? She appears a few moments later. She disappeared after Aizawa had sent Bakugo to the dorms, but she comes when Izuku calls, and he's so genuinely appreciative of that fact, when there's no contract between them. She has no obligation. She chooses to. Is everything all right? She asks him, pressing her nose to his chest. I think you should come in, Izuku admits, and doesn't try to hide what he's found out. I looked up your name. I know why Mizuchi called you Lady Kaiyo. Tamamo no Me blinks at him with her fox eyes, once, twice, and then she shifts, body pulling into itself, tail swooping low to become the hem of her kimono, whole body warping in a moment until she's human. Beautiful and tall and intimidating, except now he knows her, and he's known her for such a short time, but it's felt like so long that Izuku smiles as he bows, a bit silly, but he means it, and he loves the way she smiles in turn at him. You're such a good kid, she tells him, as she sweeps inside. She settles on the floor at the foot of his bed, folding herself gracefully, till she looks like an artfully arranged painting. Izuku closes the door and sits on the floor across from her. Rather than taking a spot where he'd be looking down, it seems far too rude. She waits for him, and he's grateful, because he's not really sure how to even start. He wants to ask about the Emperor, maybe, or how she'd escaped from the priest, but in the end he ends up blurting the thing that feels the most pressing somehow. Did you really get an Indian prince to cut off the heads of 1,000 men for you? Oh dear. Tamamo no Me shakes her head, and Izuku breathes a sigh of relief, but it only lasts until she continues. The number always grows in the retelling, but it was 100 men, not 1,000. Oh. Izuku stares at her and swallows. She's a spirit, after all, He knows what they can be like. He just might have started to think of her as different from the rest. Why? I was young, and times were different then, of course. Oh, Deku. She sighs at his expression and folds her hands together in her lap. It was almost 10,000 years ago, Kit. The world was just a bit different, and so was I. He chews on his lower lip, because she's right. That's a long time for a spirit, but... That's not the only story they tell about you, he offers, not sure what else has grown in the retelling. I suppose I might be blamed for the fall of a few dynasties, she says with a tiny shrug. I am a kitsune. It was in our nature, and it never occurred to me to be anything else at the time. And Emperor Toba? Izuku wonders, because that's where her story tends to end in the retellings. The kitsune lowers her eyes and looks at her hands, long fingers topped with fine pointed nails. They tremble, Izuku realizes. They're shaking. Would it be so strange, she says, voice soft, for a kitsune to fall in love with a man once in her life? Izuku shifts forward on his knees until he's touching the hem of her kimono, and then reaches for her hands to hold them. It's different from leaning against her side when she's a spirit. Her fingers are cold, but they warm in his grasp, as rude and inappropriate as it feels to be touching her like this. I'm sorry, he says, earnest and apologetic. I shouldn't be asking anything you don't want to talk about. I just saw the stories and it got to my head, I'm sorry. The stories say so many things, that she'd been trying to kill the Emperor, that she'd bewitched his mind, that she was evil, and he hadn't really thought. He hadn't said it against the spirit who'd let him cry against her shoulder more than once, who just lent him her power, without a price. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry or assume anything. She curls her fingers around his, and her gaze grows distant, her voice thoughtful as she tells him her story. The Emperor was a handsome man, she begins, looking away. He was wise and patient, and most of all he was curious. Our power came differently then, from those who worshipped us, or from the tales of our deeds, or from deeds we had done for the gods. I'd done quite a bit for myself. Her head tilts so that she can smile at him, eyes glinting mischievously through her lashes. I had 2 tails then, and I was very proud of myself. I thought catching the eye of another emperor would be fun. So I set out to do that, to see if I could win him over, but... She shakes her head, and her hair falls forward around her shoulders. I was the one who was won in the end. Izuku squeezes her fingers. You fell in love. Her smile grows deeper. I did. Enough that I thought perhaps I'd stay. I could hardly be an empress without bringing in too many questions about my heritage, but a consort would have been acceptable, I thought. My name then was Lady Kaiyo, but he called me his empress of his heart, and I was happy. She takes a breath. It's always interesting, when spirits have human forms, how much more human they are. He can't remember seeing her fox self ever really breathe. There was a storm, during a recital he'd arranged for my benefit. The god of the dragons flew overhead, and the wind blew the lights out, and I feared for us. I thought that the god himself was angry. I thought we were in danger, and so I... She blushes, and as if to explain without words, her whole form starts to glow, kimono and all, the same warm glow she's had previously when she'd helped fight off other spirits. His court saw me like this, my power showing, my light. It was foolish. Ryujin continued on his way, ignoring us completely, and there was nothing needed but to relight the lamps and right what had been knocked over, but from then on the court was suspicious. Her smile now shifts to something sad, and her voice grows even quieter. Toba gave me the name then, Tamamo no Me, Lady Tamamo, in the old way, for my light. The name I cherish above all others, Izuku remembers. It suits you, he says earnestly. I'm glad he gave you such a beautiful name. She nods, and the light fades as she takes another breath and continues, tone becoming almost light and dismissive, as if to get through the rest of the tale as quickly as possible. His physician was suspicious. His geomancer somehow saw right through my glamour, and they To this day, I don't know if they poisoned him to convince the Emperor of my existence or if they intended to place his son on the throne. I was stupid with love and did not see the threat. They poisoned him and whispered in his ear that it was my doing, as he grew weaker and weaker. I knew no medicine, and my power has never been in healing, but he never believed me. She tugs her hands away from Izuku and wipes at the corner of her eyes. He never believed them, and as he became more and more ill, I thought, I didn't know they were the ones behind it, so I thought I'd remain with him and take his spirit with me. I didn't want to leave him alone. Izuku suspects he knows how the rest of the tale goes. The priests and the couriers set a trap for me. During a ceremony for his health, I was very suddenly in my true form and could not change back. All I could do was run away. She wipes at her eyes again and dredges forth a smile and a tiny shrug. After that, the Emperor believed that I was to be blamed. He cursed me and sent men to kill me. Izuku's heart breaks for her, in the face of her grief when it's so clear she still loves a man who's been dead for more than 2,000 years. I'm so sorry, he says again, because there's nothing else that can be said. She reaches out and hugs him, pulling him across her crisp silks and unbothered by the closeness as she wraps her arms around him, and Izuku hugs her in turn, fiercely. I never blamed him for what they did, she admits into Izuku's ear, 2,000 years of loyalty and love remaining strong enough, Izuku aches for it, and loves her for it all the more. I will always remember him, and I will forever be Tamamo no Mae in his memory. Shota finds Bakugo in his dorm room, which is at least a good sign. He'd worried he'd find him trying to goad Kirishima or Todoroki into a sparring match, which is often his way of dealing with excess emotions. Instead, Bakugo's sitting on the edge of his bed and staring at the door as Shota comes in. Sensei, the boy says in greeting, and Shota takes a moment to take stock. Bakugo's hair is wilder than usual and looks like he's run his hands through it a few dozen times. His knuckles are raw. He's been spending every evening in one of the training gyms, and Shota now wonders how much time was spent physically fighting instead of working on his quirk. There are shadows under Bakugo's eyes that are rarely ever there, but all of his students shared a similar look when he'd returned. Bakugo's don't show any signs of fading, however. Bakugo's sitting hunched, with his arms leaning on his thighs, and Shota thinks he's missed the signs of this. He should have noticed something was wrong before now. There's no good excuse as to why he hasn't. Mind if I sit? He asks, gesturing to Bakugo's desk chair. When the boy nods, he pulls it out and sits down, then decides fuck it, and leans forward onto his arms, mirroring Bakugo's position. Want to talk about it? What are you, my therapist? Bakugo snaps back, instantly defensive. No, though we need to have a conversation about your sessions with her. Shota keeps his voice even and doesn't raise to Bakugo's tone. But I'd like to know what you were thinking and why. You knew Deku. When did you realize? When Kirishima showed me the fucking photo they released after he fucking kidnapped you, Bakugo meets his gaze and glares. I tried to tell someone, but I know that kid from school, but I don't remember his name, and he didn't have a quirk then, didn't help much when no one could find you. Shota needs to follow up on that later. If Bakugo had told someone that he'd recognized Deku, it should have been brought to his attention already. As it is, why didn't you say anything to me? Because you seem to think he's fine. Bakugo's palms spark. Because someone got into his head, Sensei, and he got into yours. Fuck, this is worse than Shota thought. He sighs and Bakugo hides a flinch. When was the last time you slept properly? Shota asks, in part to unsettle the boy, and partly because he wonders how much of this paranoia is self-fulfilling. Like I can sleep well when my teacher's been kidnapped, or when I find out the idiot kid who used to cry when you looked at him was the one who did it. Or after you brought him here, you think I can sleep? All right. Shota leans back, genuinely sorry for the state Bakugo's in. There's a lot we're going to have to unpack here, so why don't we start from the beginning? What do you remember about Deku? When did you know him? What was he like? Bakugo bares his teeth. Quirkless, weak, pathetic. He worshipped heroes. He couldn't keep from tripping over his own feet, and he'd always blame it on the ghosts. Like they made him clumsy. He was always in trouble for something. Bakugo's hands make fists that shake, even as they hang between his knees. He was quirkless, Sensei. He was quirkless. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew, and now he has a quirk, and there's only one person who could do that.
I wasn't going to just sit around this time. I had to do something.
Bakugo had spent 3 days in the care of the League of Villains. He blamed himself for Ragdoll's quirk being lost, blamed himself for All Might's retirement. From what Shota read of the reports, All for One had directly threatened to take Bakugo's quirk as well. The scars from that were going to take longer than a few therapy sessions to wipe away. When was the last time you saw Deku? Shota presses, trying to build up a better picture of who his problem child was. Was he in your class?
Yeah, we were classmates until his mom died.
Shit, there's an idea he should have thought of before now. Do you remember his mother's name? Or details about the attack that killed her?
The Hammerhead villains.
Bakugo raises a hand and grips his hair. Shota knows he's trained himself not to touch his face unless absolutely necessary, so he has different physical tics instead.
They crashed through the neighborhood. Auntie Inko was crushed under the rubble.
Okay, Inko. They could try to use that to follow the thread and maybe find something about who Deku was.
Inko Midoriya.
Bakugo nods, then blinks.
Fuck, why couldn't I remember that before?
He tries to say something and then stops, frowning.
What the fuck?
What the fuck what?
What the fuck? I can't say... But I can say Midoriya if I'm thinking of Aunt Inko.
He glares, face going through a series of expressions as he tries to reshape his mouth.
Fucking shitty Deku was... But every time I try to say it, it doesn't work. Like I forget the minute I try to say it.
He growls in frustration.
What sort of shitty quirk is this?
And of course he'd think it was a quirk. Hell, Shota would have assumed the same a week ago. Now he knows better, but he doesn't think it's something he can really cover with Bakugo at the moment. I know it looks to you that Deku worked with All for One and the League to get his quirk, he begins.
Multiple quirks, Sensei. Like the fucking Nomu. Like he fucking bragged about it.
Shota doesn't have to ask who he was. Last week, he says instead. I was fighting with the villain Demolition. Do you remember the files on him? When Bakugo nods, Shota continues. We were caught off guard, and found him in an area where he had plenty of ammunition. I caught some scrap through the shoulder. He taps where the rebar had gone through. I was pinned down. Demolition had a clear shot at me. The others were too far away. Deku saved me.
That's just it.
Bakugo pushes himself to his feet in one smooth movement, pacing the length of his dorm.
Why the hell does no one see that he must have been working with him? He's fixing quirks from Overhaul's bullets, and then he's the one villain who got away from the raid. We know the League was working with Overhaul.
And I know that Deku wasn't working with Demolition, Shota counters. When Bakugo gives him a look of pure disbelief, he shrugs slightly. He'd prefer not to expose all of Deku's personal details, but this is important. He was living in Minami Ward. He was living in one of the abandoned buildings. Demolition's appearance was a surprise to him as well. Bakugo doesn't look like he believes him, but Shota presses on. Deku has a quirk, and it wasn't given to him by All for One. The thing about his quirk is that it's very, very different than most, and it was unidentified for a long time. I've seen it work firsthand. I've seen him demonstrate it to Detective Tsukauchi, and most importantly, I've had my memories checked for meddling, Bakugo, by an expert. We don't just trust Deku blindly. He's proven time and time again that he is what he has said he is. And he does what he says he can do, and that he wants to help. He's been vetted by multiple heroes at this point, and he's being watched by even more. He's not a threat. Bakugo stands with his fist clenched so hard his hands shake.
What if you're wrong?
I don't think we are, Shota says simply. But if we are wrong, if he becomes a threat to my students or to this school, I will deal with him, the same way I would deal with any threat, to you or this school. You have my word. Bakugo exhales and relaxes his hands enough that he looks a little less wound up, a little less likely to explode.
You'd better,
he says in that tone of voice that is actually for Bakugo. Thank you. Shota takes that for what it is and nods, pushing up to stand. Bakugo doesn't do well with long, involved conversations. Better to let him stew on this for a while and check in again in a day or two. You're still benched for a week, and I still expect that essay, and you're going to talk with your therapist about this, he warns, because while Bakugo's actions might have had reasons, they don't excuse what he did. I'm also going to find out why no one mentioned what you told to me earlier, or followed up with you. Shh. Bakugo looks away, but he manages a, yes, Sensei, which is enough for Shota. And I'll remind you again, he says, because reinforcement is key for things like this, or so he's been told. You're not responsible for what the League did. You're not responsible for All Might's retirement. Those things were set into place before you ever came to UA. You're responsible for your actions, no one else's, all right? Bakugo doesn't meet his eyes. He shrugs and shoves his hands into his pockets. Yes, Sensei, he says again, with even less enthusiasm this time. They're working on it. It'll be a process, Shota knows. This is just one more step along the way. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 11. Second half to Chapter 11 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this chapter so far. I really like the backstory for Tamamo and Ame. Hope you all do as well. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.